This is an interesting panel we have here. It's a plenary panel on policy, psychedelics and policy, featuring Ken Tupper, Ethan Nadelmann, David Nutt, Ben Loenen, and moderated by Natalie Ginsberg. Natalie's going to moderate, so she'll do the introductions and organize it. But I wanted to read a little bit so you knew who Natalie is. Natalie earned her master's in social work from Columbia University in 2014 and her bachelor's in history from Yale in 2011. At Columbia, Natalie served as a policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance, where she helped legalize medical cannabis in her home state of New York and worked to end New York's racist marijuana arrests. Yeah. Sitting next to Ethan Nadelmann of the Drug Policy Alliance. Natalie's also worked as a court-mandated therapist for individuals arrested for prostitution and drug-related offenses, and as a middle school guidance counselor in the South Bronx. Natalie's clinical work with trauma survivors spurred her interest in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which she believes can ease a variety of both mental and physical ailments by addressing the root cause of individuals' difficulties rather than their symptoms. Through her work at MAPS, she's the policy and advocacy manager for MAPS. Really important job. Natalie advocates for research to provide evidence-based alternatives to both the war on drugs and the current mental health paradigm. So I'll turn you over to the very capable hands of Natalie Ginsberg. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Neil, for that introduction, and thank you to you all for staying to the last session. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to recognize something that I've been really encouraged to hear coming up throughout the day, which is the whiteness and privilege of the psychedelic community and this conference, as you can clearly see reflected by this panel. So I wanted to mention that for those of you who are committed to working to ensure that the Black and brown communities who are most harmed by the war on drugs and the war on psychedelics not only have access to psychedelic healing, but are also leading the psychedelic movement forward, please join me tomorrow for a community forum facilitated by my dear friend Camille Barton called White Allies and Anti-Racist Practice in the Psychedelic Community, which is at 11 a.m. But so despite the whiteness and maleness of this panel, I am truly, deeply, deeply honored to be sitting here today with these four pioneering men from whom I've learned so much. These men don't really need much of introduction for many of us in this room, so I've asked them to each share some brief introductory remarks before I get to asking them some questions. So, Ben, you'd like to start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. So yeah, I just wanted to start explaining a bit who I am. My name is Benjamin de Luna. I'm founder of ICEERS Foundation, a foundation that focuses very much on the psychedelic plant medicines, ayahuasca, iboga, and others. And I'm a filmmaker of training, so I really didn't have any clue about policy several years ago. And then in 2009 started ICEERS, after I was really sitting as a film student next to the beds of people going through ibogaine experiences and really see the profound changes and the healing that people were going through, and really wondering, like, why is this illegal in several countries in the world and not available? So I got really so interested in iboga, then later in ayahuasca, and it was quite recent after I founded ICEERS that we got contacted about the legal case in Chile, where people were raided in a ceremony. We decided to help, and we started really to work with them along through all the case, and made the documentary about it. And when the trailer got online, that's when many other people started to contact us and saying, we have legal problems, please help. And so quite organically, we really got involved in legal defense and starting to see the big difference between how they saw the work they were doing with these sacred plants for many of them. While to the prosecutors, it was really, they saw it as just one molecule, a dangerous one, and people should be locked up. So that became really an important part of our work. And after several years, it was in 2014 that we really saw, like, okay, this is, in ayahuasca and the other plants really have a big difference from the other psychedelics, is that on the UN level they are not under international control, so they are not part of the 1971 convention. So really with other psychedelics we're working to get them out of illegality. Here there is this space where they are not under international control, and that it's on a national level where these plants can be criminalized or not. No? And in many countries, there's no clear regulation about this. So seeing that whole need and the fact that ayahuasca was booming so much, no, I think it's the plant which now is really in the picture. We figured it was important to bring together all of these lawyers, policy experts who had worked around this field. And so when we organized the first World Ayahuasca Conference in Ibiza, that's when we brought all of these people together. Ethan was there, Ken as well. We sat in a room and we kind of discussed, like, you know, what can we do? Can we join forces and bring all of this expertise together? And really start seeing each of these legal cases as an opportunity to educate about really what's at hand. You know, to bring in not just the scientific aspects and the proof we have that these are plants that are relatively safe, that they have you know, therapeutic potential, but also really bringing the cultural dimensions into that whole debate, and how that cultural dimension of cultures that are really long-standing and much more ancient than the drug control system, how these two really have attention. So that's what we did, and that later on led to us starting this program called the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. Until now, we have been working now for several years really with cases and trying to, you know, shift every challenge into an opportunity for achieving some more sensible policy in these countries. So that's just what I wanted to share, and that's a bit my angle in how I got into this. And in our foundation, really, we focus on the plant medicines. No, I know this is broader, focused on psychedelics.
Thanks, Ben. So my name is Kenneth Tupper. I'm the Director of Implementation and Partnerships at the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use, a new institution in British Columbia that just launched April 1st of this year. But before that, I left my job in February that I had for 14 years previously, doing harm reduction policy and prevention policy in the Population and Public Health Division of the British Columbia Ministry of Health. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pathway that brought me there and my interest in the topic of psychedelics. For my undergrad, I did humanities, English and philosophy as a double major, and then became an English as a second language teacher. And it was in the mid-90s that I was reading some books about plants such as ayahuasca. I came across in Terence McKenna's book, Food of the Gods, and Wade Davis's book, One River. Both of them mentioned this substance or brew called ayahuasca, and both of them referenced the idea of it being a plant teacher. And I thought that was quite interesting, this metaphor of plant teacher. And I knew from the 1960s there were claims of cognitive enhancement and creative insights from the use of drugs like LSD, and I thought maybe there's, you know, something there to be teased out in this sort of potential non-medical or cognitive enhancement potential of these substances. So I thought, you know, it's a kind of a radical idea, but maybe I'll apply to graduate school and see if I can develop the idea of entheogenic education. And much to my surprise, I not only got into the program at Simon Fraser University, but I got a fellowship to basically go down to Brazil and participate in Santa Daime ceremony, which was a sort of life-changing experience. And came back, finished writing my thesis on the topic of entheogenic education, and at the same time got involved with a group called Dance Safe that was doing harm reduction at big raves, as they were called back then. And it's funny because I was a folk musician. I wasn't really in the electronic music scene, but I thought there was a cool project that I heard about, and went out and started volunteering, ended up running the chapter, and from that I got connected to a group in Vancouver that was trying to open a supervised injection site doing public education events, and they invited me to come and participate and volunteer. And from that, I met somebody who had left that group to go and do HIV policy at the Ministry of Health. And basically, about 8 months later, I got an email out of the blue asking if I would consider coming to work in the Ministry of Health, working on the prevention file he had been asked to take on, in addition to HIV, drug abuse prevention, as it was called at the time. So that was sort of the entry point into a public policy career. And at the same time, I applied to a PhD program and ended up doing a dissertation on the globalization of ayahuasca and the public policy implications of its uptake in countries outside of South America, drawing on the knowledge that I was learning about through my policy position in government, but very much having to keep these two things firewalled, as you might imagine. My day job, you know, very much within the mainstream health system, but my academic interests in pursuing the sort of understanding of the intersections of how ayahuasca was emerging from the Amazon and creating real challenges for liberal democratic governments that are trying simultaneously to uphold competing principles of public health, criminal justice, religious freedom or human rights, and now I would add also to that free market capitalism. So that was sort of what led me to basically being recruited a little while ago to join the new BC Centre on Substance Use, and we just announced today we're going to be starting up a psychedelic research program in Vancouver to try to bring Canada back into the fold for this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Ethan Nadelmann. I'm the head of the Drug Policy Alliance, and I've been involved in this field for a very long time. I started studying about drugs and drug policy, international drug policy, back in the early 80s as a graduate student at Harvard. I talked my way into the State Department's Narcotics Bureau, got a security clearance, interviewed drug enforcement agents in 19 countries around the world, wrote a dissertation and a few books about international drug control. I went to Princeton in the late 80s to teach, and while I was there, I started to speak out and write about the war on drugs, which in the late 1980s was just absolutely outrageous. It was like McCarthyism on steroids, just absolute madness, and the whole, virtually the entire public across the political spectrum supporting it. And I became involved with a new organization, the Drug Policy Foundation. I organized a working group at Princeton University of academics from around the country to think about alternative drug policies. One of its members was Sasha Shulgin, who had been very discreet in his research for many years, but had been radicalized when they tried to pass the Controlled Substances Analogs Act, which would have criminalized his work. And then in '92, I was lucky to get a phone call out of the blue from a guy named George Soros, who some of you may have heard of, and wealthy billionaire philanthropist, not quite as famous then as he is now. And the result of that was my leaving the university to create an organization, really the first project in his foundation, called the Lindesmith Center, named after Alfred Lindesmith, who was the first prominent scholar in the US to challenge conventional thinking about drug policy. And I built that thing up both within the US and internationally, and then in 2000, spun it out of Soros's foundation, merged it with this Drug Policy Foundation, which had fallen on hard times, and we created the Drug Policy Alliance. And I've spent the last 17 years building that up with my colleagues into really the leading and most influential organization in the US and perhaps the world working to end the war on drugs, right? I mean, that's what it's been about. And I mean, you know, we fundamentally believe that the war on drugs, the decision to treat certain psychoactive substances as criminal, and anybody who uses them, grows them, makes them, sells them, buys them as criminal for some substances but not others, is a fundamentally rotten, despicable violation of human rights, waste of taxpayer money, destroying millions, if not tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of lives all around the world. And that it's a good life to lead to try to end that madness both in our own country and around the world. I'm proud that we've played a major role in the movement to legalize marijuana for medical and other purposes. We played a pivotal role in the efforts to transform public opinion around mass incarceration in this country and to roll back incarceration and to try to uproot and to expose the racism that drives the war on drugs both in this country and around the world, and also to push forward the notions that drug use and drug addiction and drug misuse have to be treated overwhelmingly as health issues, not as criminal issues. And that applies across the board on these substances. And so I should just say in this moment, it's a quite poignant moment for me because I will be stepping down as head of Drug Policy Alliance at the end of next week. And so this was my last public speech or appearance as head of DPA. And it's been quite a ride, I'll tell you that. I'm not going to be leaving this movement. The way I see it is I spent 7 years doing this as a Princeton professor and 6 years building the Lindesmith Center within Soros's foundation and 17 building up DPA. And I'm looking forward to the fourth incarnation, but it's I think, the right moment and a good moment for me and for my organization and for this movement to try to hand off the baton and have this thing grow to the next level. So, thanks.
So I suppose at one small level, I'm a victim of the war on drugs, having been sacked by the British government for saying what was actually pretty obvious, that alcohol was more harmful than cannabis. Of course, at that time, you know, I wasn't alone, but there weren't so many voices. But it was very pleasing 2 years ago when President Obama agreed with me, and now everyone knows I was right. So, but I'm still not advising the British government, and won't be for a long time, I'm sure, because we've actually. So, as you probably gathered, if you don't know me, I'm David Nutt. I'm an English psychiatrist, and I've worked in the field of drugs and alcohol abuse and addiction all my professional career, which is a lot longer than anyone else in this room here, or at least up here. I've championed the idea that we might, by applying evidence and reason and perhaps developing methods of properly arbitrating on the relative harms of drugs across different dimensions of harm, come up with a sensible and transparent matrix which will help us make decisions. I thought that was an extremely sensible thing to do, and I spent 9 years as head of the scientific group looking at drugs for the British government, doing just that. The problem was, when the results came out, it showed that alcohol was more harmful than, as I say, than cannabis, and way more harmful than drugs like mushrooms or LSD. That people got quite upset about that, because it didn't fit with the political narrative. And as we all know, most of the decision-making around drugs that's happened in the last 150 years has been driven by politics and not by science. And that's why it's actually it's very nice to be at a meeting like this, where science is in the title, and science is growing. And because I think it's only through science are we going to finally challenge this terrible hegemony of decision-making that politicians have foisted on us, and not just on us, but also on the rest of the world as well. So let's go for science. Let's try to keep building an evidence base, and let's always challenge politicians, because they are very good liars. But if we continually oppose and react to their dishonesty by putting evidence and evidence and evidence in front of them, eventually I think they will have to just concede, and then hopefully more rational policies will come through. But it's going to be driven by us, by the grassroots. It's not going to be driven by them. So champion the cause. Thank you.
So that's a really nice segue, actually, into the first topic of conversation. I'm going to pose a few questions on this topic to you all, and I hope you answer those that resonate and engage each other in a dialogue also. So considering that this community is filled with scientists and researchers, I'm hoping you can all tell us a bit about the role science plays in your policy work, and specifically if you see any dangers in politicizing science, and how does media fit in that equation? And then on top of that, if we as advocates demand evidence-based policies, do researchers have an obligation to engage in policy conversations and educate the media?
I'll start. I mean, I think that science need not be politicized, but it is so often and inevitably politicized, in part because of the ways that funding works and the powerful role that government plays in funding research or in tolerating the funding of research. I mean, it seems to me that having been involved in this, and I should also say that for the mission of Drug Policy Alliance, you know, we're about ending the war on drugs. We're about reducing the harms of both drug use and the harms of drug prohibition. We're about respecting the sovereignty of people over their own minds and bodies. And we're about advancing drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. That's our mission and our vision statement, and science comes first in that. Now, that said, when I've looked at the drug war over the last 30 years, I mean, what you see among many of the scientists working on drug policy, and so many of them funded by the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse, which provides the funding for the majority of research funding in the world, is that's a profoundly, profoundly politicized agency. And when you see the scientists who work in this field, what you see is that trying to do innovative research on drugs, in America for very long was like trying to do innovative social science research in the old Soviet Union, in the sense that you learned that there were certain questions you're just not supposed to ask and certain answers you're not supposed to give. And that even maybe to raise those questions would mean that you might not be asked to serve on the next review committee, and that your proposals for funding would be given to people who were known to be more cooperative or would be known to be hostile to you. And so I think what we saw happen in the research community in this country for sure was that most of the scientists working on drugs and drug abuse essentially developed political blinders. And over time, those political blinders became intellectual blinders to the point that they even forgot to realize that there are other interesting questions to be asked because, well, couldn't be funded. Why even bother think about that? I think one of the wonderful things that MAPS has done in this area, and we've seen it happen in some others as well, is really to push up against this, just through persistently saying, let the science stand, and to push and to hold the government accountable to their own rules to move this thing forward. You know, as for the question about whether or not scientists should be involved politically, I think that has to really be left up to the individual scientist. I think the thing that is incumbent upon all scientists, whether or not they want to be engaged in political advocacy, is to be conscious of the extent to which the research funding, to which the streams, to which the environment in which they work is politicized, and also to the extent to which the findings that they produce may sometimes be used by government in advance of oppressive policies, not on behalf of enlightened policies.
Yeah, I mean, I would go a little bit further. I would say that actually a lot of the so-called science around drugs and particularly around drug harms, is some of the worst science there's ever been. And I find it appalling that for so long, so-called scientists spent their time trying to find reasons to ban drugs, doing studies with the sole ambition that they would find something that they could then claim was a problem. And we saw that actually going back to some of the very first systematic studies of LSD, one of Charles Schuster's first studies. The only thing they could find that was negative about the effects of LSD in that study was that one or two of the participants were a little bit sarcastic to the investigator, but that was seen as an adverse effect. Of course, it got a lot worse with MDMA. The so-called science of MDMA and brain damage is arguably the worst science in the worst episode of misinformation in the whole history of neuroscience. It was promulgated because your government wanted MDMA, wanted a reason to have MDMA banned. And the scientists that lined up to produce studies that said it was bad really should look at themselves very carefully, because they have done an enormous, enormous disservice to not just the scientific community, but also to humanity. Because if every year you deny access of a potentially viable treatment to people because you have made false assertions about harm, you are causing hundreds of thousands of people to die through suicide or through alcoholism unnecessarily. And people don't think about that. They think, oh, we've got to... One of the things I'd like to do before I die is I'd like to create a metric called the number needed to kill. And the drug science has probably killed more people through bad science than any other kind of science has killed people.
So I'll give a slightly different perspective, although I agree with everything you've said. I think we shouldn't be too surprised that science is politicized, because the very roots of science, going back in the history of science, it was a politicized enterprise. When Francis Bacon in the early 17th century began some of the early sort of articulation of the scientific approach, it was very much an instrumental a way of engaging in methodology that was going to serve the state, and he was very explicit in that, and that the impetus for finding certain knowledge through this new methodology was more to overcome the religious wars of the Protestants and the Catholics at the time than it was to sort of find some kind of independent, apoliticized knowledge. Now, I think it's sort of morphed into something quite different today, but the roots of it are somewhat reflective of why we see it politicized still today. So that's not surprising. And then having worked within government, I hate to shock you, but the idea of evidence being the sole formation of policy is, that's the ideal perhaps, but the reality is often the policy is set and then bureaucrats are asked to find the evidence to support the decision after the fact. So that's just the real politic of the kinds of governance structures that we work within. So I think it's incumbent, as Ethan said, for scientists to sort of think about the implications of their work and how the idea of evidence-based policy needs to be contrasted with the idea of policy-based evidence, and to think about how the evidence that is generated is itself a construct of the political environment in which even the research imagination is constrained, certain kinds of questions that are not even conceived of in the first place, and then the sort of funneling approach as to what comes out as authorized knowledge for, again, bureaucrats to put forward to decision makers is a very tiny fraction of the types of knowledge that might be possibly generated, where the conservative peer-reviewed granting processes, the journal publication, the peer review process, at each stage kind of brings constraining to the kinds of knowledge that become available is very much different. And thinking about other types of knowledge that might be available, such as traditional indigenous forms of knowledge that fortunately I think are starting to get some recognition, that perhaps the sort of rigid way we've thought about knowledge informing policy, purely sort of quantified, mathematical-based knowledge might not be the only kinds that are of going to be advantage to us, especially in the 21st century and the sort of ecological crisis that we're facing. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add because most of it is said. We see in our work, very very much, of course, that very bad science or twisted interpretations of scientific publications is really at the basis of sometimes legal decisions or policy decisions. So for us, science is a very important tool to really counter that, and to give clarity on what really we know about these plants. And I think also what we see very much is that there's such an emphasis just on the substance, on the molecule, and forgetting that you really, the safety and the potential benefits have to do the same amount on the context of use, the intention, and all it around it. So isolating substances, I think, also is a danger, and really twist what you can say about risks and what that means for policy. So I think that's also very important. Social sciences are very important, and to really look at the culture or the context that these plants or these substances are used in.
So for this next topic of conversation, maybe see Dr. Nutt's slide with the relative harms of drugs, please. So who is harmed the most from psychedelic prohibition, and how does that guide our strategy for psychedelic policy change? And what are the dangers and benefits of separating psychedelics and cannabis from other drugs, and of separating plant medicines from synthetic drugs and from street drugs? What are the dangers and benefits of separating psychedelics and cannabis from other drugs, and from separating plant medicines and synthetic drugs and street drugs?
I think that's a good question, because of course the big problem is a drug war, and it's twisted. It's really very problematic in terms of human rights. So separating, of course, I think every organization or person has a specific focus in work, and we focus on more of the plant medicines, if you will. But I think ultimately, if you build up an argumentation where you demonize one drug and then through that try to give credibility to another one, that's a big problem, And we see that sometimes, run in the ayahuasca world, in the iboga world as well, sometimes where they really use that. These are the bad drugs, but we have ibogaine and that's the great thing, or ayahuasca and that's a great thing. So I think there's ultimately all of these pieces of the puzzle should be part of the same bigger picture, which is we have to end the drug war. No? We have to really stop this nonsense and move forward and think about how these plants and substances can be properly integrated into society. And then the first question about the harm, I mean, it's clear that some substances have more potential for harm than other substances, but again, it depends very much also on the context of use and everything around it, so that should be taken very much into account as well there. But of course, none of that is reason to really put people in jail or have a justice approach to the use of these substances. And I think it's important that we really treat it from a health perspective. And also, not just talk about harm reduction, but also, for example, risk reduction is a term that, where we are in Spain is very accepted. So where you acknowledge that drugs don't necessarily cause harms and that you can reduce those harms, but that maybe they don't cause harms, but there's risks that they could cause harms and you reduce the risks. And then a step further is talking about benefit maximization, which I think is very important as well, looking at the fact that sometimes there's no risk, but there's benefits, and how can you really avoid harms to happen and benefits to be maximized. So I think that's a big part of our work.
Thanks, Ben. So it's important to remember that the war on drugs is actually not a war against drugs, it's a war against people and the people who use drugs. So it's helpful also to remember that public policy is very much shaped by the public and political discourses that we all swim in as language users, and that the metaphors that are used to frame policy problems often constrain or shape the kinds of solutions that are generated. So I'll put to you the idea that our dominant drug policies in the international drug control regime are shaped by two primary metaphors. One is that drugs are demons, that they undermine free will and autonomy, and that the people who use drugs are bad and need to be punished. And that metaphor is very explicit in much of the early 20th century, or late 19th century, when you see the prohibition of alcohol and other drugs sort of emerging as a policy issue. But at the same time, there was this sort of contrasting metaphor as drugs as pathogens, like viruses or bacteria, by which we understand people who use them to be sick and in need of treatment, and we also use the idea of inoculation for drug education programs. Youth need to be inoculated against this. So those metaphors actually exist in this strange symbiosis where you've got the criminal justice perspective on one hand and the health perspective on the other. But we have to remember that metaphors are not a depiction of reality. They're just a way that we frame our thinking, and that perhaps those metaphors aren't an accurate picture at all. I would propose an alternative metaphor that could be very helpful in describing exactly what Ben talked about, which is that drugs are tools, and like any tool, can be used for good or bad purposes, have good or bad outcomes depending on who's using it, for what intention, in what context, and that with that kind of alternative metaphorical framing, we can have a much better informed sort of policy perspective and come up with perhaps new and better solutions or ideas as how to deal with the issues that psychoactive substances pose for us as human beings.
No, I agree with what Ken and Ben were saying. Let me put a couple of frames on this. I mean, the first one is the underlying value system that I and many in drug policy reform bring to this is about our freedom of consciousness, right? That we as sovereign human beings have a right of sovereignty over our own minds and bodies. And I think most of us can agree with that and understand that that may not be an absolute right, but it should be a right that's given enormous deference by government and by laws in society. And in the United States, one of the things that sort of kept us honest, and perhaps the single most elevated element of American constitutional culture and history, has been our First Amendment, right? The freedoms of speech, press, religion, and assembly. Right? And what we know is that with each of those freedoms, they don't just protect elevated and good speech and press and religion assembly, they also need to protect the bad ones, the ugly ones, the despicable ones, right? And then if you start to make a distinction between the good and the bad, ultimately you're going to lose everything. And it doesn't mean it's absolute. It doesn't mean, as we say, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's taking speech too far, right? You can't, perform human sacrifice as part of your religious freedom. You can't libel. I mean, there are limits to it when it hurts others. But by and large, that fundamental freedoms mean freedom for the good and for the bad. And I look about the issue about our freedom around drugs the same way. I'm your basic marijuana and mushrooms guy, right? I mean, that's what I like. And as long as MDMA used to work for me, I love that one too, right? The 3 M's, they're all good for me, right? Cocaine, I don't want to be on a party where people doing a lot of cocaine, right? And opiates, right? I'm no big fan of that stuff, and meth and all that. But the fact of the matter is, to draw a distinction when it comes to individuals and their use and their consumption of those things, and to say, okay, you're using marijuana, that's cool, that's chill, not so dangerous. Using psychedelics, they're elevated. But you, putting methamphetamine into heroin in your system, oh no, you have to be criminalized. You deserve to be criminalized simply for possessing, owning, using, consuming that substance, even in the absence of any evidence that you've done harm to others? No. That's not what the underlying freedom of consciousness is about. Now, that doesn't mean that we should treat all of the distribution systems and the legal regulatory systems the same. It doesn't mean that marijuana regulation should be the same as mushrooms regulation, should be the same as MDMA regulation, should be the same as methamphetamine regulation. I mean, those can vary dramatically, right? But it does mean that when it comes to the personal consumption or use of these things, there needs to be a holistic understanding of that basic right. Nothing gets me, many things get me upset, but one thing that gets me upset is that when people in the psychedelics world sort of distance themselves, our good drugs, those bad drugs, and our right of elevated consciousness, but not theirs. No, it's not acceptable. It's not right.
Yes, so the person behind that graph, I just wanted to say, reflect on a couple of things. The first is, people say, well, that's just the Brits. But in fact, it was more that we managed as a result of this. We got a grant from Europe, European community, to redo the analysis. We took 30 experts from 20 European countries. And I won't go into the details of how we conduct this multi-criteria analysis, but in essence, each of those points represents a total of 16 variables. So there's 20 drugs. So you can see so we redid it with every single the scaling of all 20 drugs on each of those variables was changed by the European experts. And the weighting of every variable was changed. And the final result was identical. So that tells us it's not just a peculiar British analysis. This is something that, at least on the other side of the Atlantic, experts across the whole of Europe agree on. It's robust. It probably does reflect what's going on in the real world, and it probably reflects, oh, there it is, the European. You can't tell the difference other than the colors. I'd like to do it here. I'd like to do it in the USA. I don't know why we haven't. Well, I know why we haven't. We haven't because no one's funded it. We've tried to get grants to do it here, but no one's come up with the money. And it's not a lot of money, but we're not going to swim across the Atlantic. We're going to have to fly at least. So at some point we'd like to do it here because it might be different. But actually more than that, the process of doing it really does make people think a lot about what's going on. Because no individual knows all the data behind those 16 variables. You have to do it as a group, you have to do it with experts across a range of different disciplines. And that the process of doing it creates a community of knowledge which is greater than any of us can have. And so I would strongly encourage expert groups in the US to think about doing it because it's a powerful way of moving your knowledge base to another level. That was the first thing to say. The second thing is I'm interested in long been interested in the role that the drinks industry has had in controlling the narrative about drugs. I mean, one perspective you could take is that back in the 1860s, in here and in Europe, pretty much every drug was legal. You could go to your local pharmacist and you could buy tincture of heroin, tincture of cannabis, tincture of cocaine, and alcohol, and nicotine. They're all legal. And over the next 100 years, they all became illegal, except tobacco and alcohol. And those two big power blocks, commercial power blocks, I'm sure have had quite a profound influence in terms of trying to control the market, trying to eliminate any other recreational drug. And I have no doubt, in fact we know, that the drinks industry was a major player in trying to eliminate the rise of recreational MDMA. They saw it as an enormous threat to their profitability. And they were some of the strongest lobbyists, certainly in the UK, to getting MDMA made illegal. In fact, if you look at the profile of alcohol consumption in Britain over the last 60 years, it's like this, but there was a little dip when the rave scene happened. The only impact we've ever had in terms of national alcohol consumption was when people started to substitute MDMA for alcohol. And that the drinks industry latched on that, and they promoted the fear of MDMA through national campaigns to a point where politicians eventually gave in. And of course, they bribed politicians as well. So the drinks industry is enormously influential in all this. And you know, I've seen from what I've read about what's happened here, in some states, drinks companies have been desperately trying to undermine the legal cannabis campaign because they see it as a threat. And what I'm putting out to you now is that that's the past. I just hope, now that you have commercial cannabis, that the people who are selling cannabis don't turn on the other drugs in the same way as the drinks industry turned on cannabis. So watch out for that, please.
I'll say the way you mentioned the alcohol industry really reminds me also of the influence the pharmaceutical industry has had on drug policy in the US in particular. So I guess along these lines, I'm curious where you all think the difference in the harms of psychedelic prohibition falls from the difference, what is the difference between the harms of psychedelic prohibition and the harms from greater drug policy prohibition? And how does that guide our policy forward in considering how to move forward with psychedelics?
Well, I think just since I got the microphone, I mean, normally when I teach the uneducated, not you lot because you're very knowledgeable, but normally when I talk to the general public, I say that the banning of LSD was a remarkable occurrence because it's the first time a drug has been banned simply because it changed the way people voted. And I have no doubt that is true. I can't prove it, but it's clear that the narrative at the time of the banning of LSD was all about trying to make sure that American youth, particularly men, carried on joining the military and didn't want to come live in Haight-Ashbury and listen to the Grateful Dead, etc. And the banning of LSD was a political decision. The war on drugs was also a political decision, but that was kind of couched to some extent in harm reduction. But there is no question. Now, sorry, this is a slide I prepared earlier. But I mean, this is an amazing phenomenon. Hopefully you all know this. But LSD was banned in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in America, Bobby Kennedy, Secretary of State, would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. Even he could not stop the bureaucrats, the CIA and the DEA getting LSD banned. And that tells you something about history, but it also tells you something about bureaucracy and the power of bureaucrats to stop things happening or to make negative things happen is still enormous. We have still, it's still almost impossible. How many people in America have researched LSD since it was banned? None. Even though it's legal to research it. There's no law that says you cannot research LSD, but the practicalities of studying LSD in America, no one's ever surmounted. It took us a great deal of trouble and time to surmount them in Britain. And we're fighting that battle all the time. So please never underestimate the power of bureaucrats and individuals whose life has to some extent, completely dependent on fighting a fictitious war on drugs to keep them paid. Don't underestimate the negative passive power of bureaucracy, because it's already, it's not gone away. You're still paying their salaries, and they've got to do something.
So I think the question was about the harms from psychedelic prohibition versus broader drug prohibition. I mean, if you're somebody who gets busted with LSD or mushrooms or MDMA, I think it's a moot point. You're facing criminal prosecution. And however, it's very much a reflection of the panel that it's unlikely that you're going to get busted because the majority of users are white, middle class, and not going to be subject to the same kinds of scrutiny as more unfortunate members of society. So it seems there's a differential just in terms of the demographics of the kinds of people who are interested in this at the moment. That might change. But the broader, as Ethan's articulated, the broader war on drugs, we need to separate the harms from drugs themselves from the harms of drug policy. And it's pretty clear that the harms from the latter are much more egregious than the harms from drugs themselves.
Yeah. I think also the fact, the prohibition of psychedelics is a bit what David is referring to, like the whole development and acceptance of tools for new ways of dealing with mental health issues or issues where we don't really have effective treatments for is really greatly affected by this whole prohibition as well. And then in terms of the plants, of course, that's what I said before, this whole cultural dimension to it, where very long-standing cultural traditions then all of a sudden find themselves being considered criminals. And there have been shamans, 8th-generation shamans traveling, bringing their culture to other places that then are locked up and basically seen as criminals. So there's a big issues around that. But I think sometimes, and I've heard this in the drug policy world, where they consider sometimes psychedelics a bit as a luxury thing, or it's it's not so important because really the harms that are done to people are not so extreme. It's not like people are shot like in the Philippines. 8,000 whatever people are killed. In the DPA conference, the last one, there was this person just coming out of jail for like 20 grams of marijuana, I think it was, after 28 years. I mean, that's like really incredible seeing that happen. So maybe with psychedelics, and maybe because it's more of a white population that's using, we don't really see those type of harms to people. But I think on the long run, we're really losing time in developing tools that really I think are crucial for humanity and really have a lot to offer to us. So I think that's a big harm.
I would just say, I think that's just, when it comes to the harms of prohibition, the prohibition of psychedelics is causing fairly tiny harm, right, in this country and around the world compared to the prohibitions of many other psychoactive substances, just in terms of the numbers of people affected, the numbers of people being arrested, the numbers of who's being persecuted, all of these things. And so when you focus your efforts, as we do a Drug Policy Alliance, on the largest groups getting hurt, and it's about cocaine and heroin, methamphetamine and marijuana, where you see the massive numbers, and psychedelics seems relatively small. When you focus on the commonality of the principle, then essentially to some extent it's all the same thing. Because for an individual who's gotten busted or arrested or beat up by the state, whether it was for psychedelics or methamphetamine, what difference does it make really? There the principle remains exactly the same. When you look at the harms of prohibition in terms of what does it mean that this substance is being produced in the illicit market rather than a legal regulated market, well there those can be substantially, with marijuana, not between illegally produced marijuana and legally produced marijuana, there is a difference, especially if you're using it medically and have to worry about certain things. But when you're using more powder type substances, as opposed to, a substance coming out of the ground, it can actually be risk of death, right? Whether you're taking, whether it's an opioid or whether it's something you believe to be a psychedelic, and because you're getting it in an illicit market and it's not properly being tested or whatever, you can land up dead. And it's bad all around. When it comes to the upsides of these substances, I'll say that when we began on the issue of marijuana reform 30 years ago, we knew about the medical value, but we had no idea it would be so extraordinarily beneficial. I mean, all of the science that's emerging around marijuana is fantastic. And with psychedelics, we knew, because there had been the early research in the 50s and 60s, there were these benefits. But to see the work being done by MAPS and Hefter and others, and the evidence, I mean, so the upsides of these substances significant, not quite the same as others. Although I wonder if 20 years from now, we'll be realizing that actually nicotine has more substantial medical benefits than we know now. Now it's a highly demonized but still legal drug. But will it turn out to have medical properties that we have not taking advantage of right now because it is demonized? There are other substances as well. So I think there's these commonalities, as a matter of principle, and a great lost opportunity on the medical value of psychedelics and to some extent marijuana and maybe some others. But the principle remains the same.
So for the last bit of time, I wanted to turn questions to the audience. So if people have questions, can you please line up behind this microphone?
Hi. 2 quick points. Number one, while heroin was ravaging poor people of color, nobody seemed to care in this country. But when heroin was ravaging poor people of color, no one seemed to care in this country. But when the marijuana prohibition has been lifted in over half the states, and it turned out that white folks were using more heroin and prescription drugs, suddenly we had an epidemic. Which leads me to my second point. In policy, what hasn't been brought up is the fact that the media is highly complicit in this whole thing. We have headlines and headlines and headlines that just any bad thing about drugs would get press. Now, that is changing. In addition to putting on, okay, I want to get your question about the media. In addition to putting pressure on our politicians, we should put pressure on our media, and this is the question, and the advertisers of the media. Because in the last week, we found out that pressure on advertisers have gotten rid of a piece of pond scum like Bill O'Reilly. Do you favor the media getting hammered?
I will ask a question. First, I want to congratulate the panel, and I want to congratulate Natalie for your work. It's really welcoming to see drug policy being a topic to be talked about in these conferences. To the question that I will get to, but the comment is, I will ask the question, just 1 second, sir. My question is, what do you think about creating a kind of a scientific coalition of scientists and organizations that would engage in dialogue with some of the international organizations, such as the World Health Organization, the INCB? They're showing openness to dialogue, and there is a, let's say, a mandate to open dialogue with the scientific community. And I will have a last comment, which is, I do think that scientists ought to become more politically involved, because science itself will not bring the systematic changes that we need to see in this field. And I wonder why we do all this research anyway in the first place when we already know that these are very beneficial substances. So the question is whether you think a panel would be good.
Maybe we'll take a few questions at a time and then answer.
Yes. Hello. I represent a site called Psychonaut Wiki, and one of the first things that we learned, or that I learned, was this kind of distinction between the word drug and the word substance. And it's not something that I had really considered before, just being an American, but as we are serving an international audience, it's just something that kind of like made me rethink some things. And it also made me wonder, like, what like the experts think about this distinction. Is it something that is worthwhile to kind of, disseminate education on? Is it just a pedantic point? Just something of that nature. One of your thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Luis Fernando Toffoli. I'm from Brazil. I'm a psychiatrist. I'd like to ask what you... well, there's this idea that when you're talking about controlling drugs in terms of prohibition, we are actually controlling undesirable populations. And then the Chinese with opium, cocaine with black people in America, marijuana, black people in Brazil, Mexicans in America. So my question is, why are psychedelic users so undesirable for the government? So they have to be controlled and their drug will be controlled.
It's a fashion sense.
I think the undesirable population that led to the prohibition of psychedelics, David Nutt already mentioned, was in the 1960s. It was the youth population. It was the counterculture. You know, the threat that was perceived by young people talking about crazy ideas like peace and love and eating organic vegetables was perceived, I think, to be such a threat that these substances had to be restricted. And of course, the irony was that prohibition effectively kept them out of the hands of researchers and clinicians, didn't do as much to keep them off the street. So, you know, there's, I think, some lessons to be learned in that. But, you know, now we're living with that legacy of, you know, a very different kind of situation today.
Forgotten what they were, sorry. The difference between a drug and a substance, yeah, it's a moot point. I think that I'd use them interchangeably, frankly. I think the slight problem comes with drug companies, pharmaceutical companies. They kind of don't, you know, they'd like it to be substances rather than drugs because they like to have control of drugs.
I would just quickly say, with Armando's idea about panels of scientists and others, anything that can help move things forward is a good idea, and gatherings of scientists is a good one. On the media question, sure, the media is so dramatically better today than it was 30 years ago when there were fewer media channels and they were overwhelmingly on behalf of the war on drugs. So I appreciate the heterogeneity of it now, and I'm skeptical of how much we can intimidate media to be better on these things. I think in the psychedelics area there's been tremendous success in generating mostly positive media. And on the issue that David just addressed around substance versus drug, I agree with him. Not much of a difference. I think the interesting one, you know, 3 of the formative books for me when I was getting started back in the 80s was Andrew Weil's book, The Natural Mind, Norman Zinberg's book, Drug Set and Setting, and Stanton Peele's book, The Meaning of Addiction. And those 3 books put together, what they really sort of drove home was the point that what we're talking about here is about healthy and unhealthy relationships. The point that one could have a healthy or unhealthy relationship to a psychoactive substance, or a healthy or unhealthy relationship to another human being, or to another activity. So the difference is not whether it's substance or psychedelic drug or other drug. It's really about the nature of the relationship and how we as individuals manage this, and the ways in which society and our legal context can facilitate healthier set and settings or less healthy set and settings.
I'll just add also that a major change that's happened is the internet and the transmission of knowledge through alternative channels to the mainstream media, such as podcasts and obviously social media vehicles that really allow for people to share experiences and narratives that can't really be controlled by a sort of any collusion or any kind of sort of concerted effort to create a dominant narrative. So that's a real game changer. And you know, the younger generation who are most attuned to this are the ones who are most questioning the status quo paradigm. And paradigm shifts tend to happen slowly, but they happen as a result of change, not because the older generation necessarily turns on to the new idea, but you know, they just age and get out of the game or die, and the younger generation comes along thinking new ideas. So I think we're in the midst of a paradigm shift right now with respect to what I'm witnessing, and especially the younger people here at this conference, for example, and campuses across the country.
So in the interest of time, I should let our last panelist make their stand, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to you. But we have to move on because of that crazy ferry ride. So excuse me for interrupting this wonderful conversation.
Well, you know, I think everything said, but I basically just also think that we are on the verge of we're changing society's relationship with psychedelics and probably drugs in general, bit by bit. And I also agree that the internet and the ways of transmission of information is really crucial in that, and that people have more and more access really to what really is going on and the real story after these substances.
Sum us up, Natalie. Bring us to a close.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I guess we are at time, so people don't miss the boat, literally. But I hope if you're all interested in continuing the conversations around psychedelics and policy, you find me and engage your fellow conference attendees, because I'm really encouraged that this conversation is growing, and I hope we all continue it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.